Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Kalik, and this is Dispatches. The Western media doesn't usually pay attention to Pakistan, except in as much as it relates to America and the war on terror. So it's hard to know who to rely on for information. Pakistan's recently deposed leader had made claims of an American backed coup due to his non aligned foreign policy, and his removal has been followed by massive countrywide protests. Imran Khan is a complicated and contradictory figure who rose to power thanks to his celebrity status and his philanthropy, but also because of his months long protest movement that dominated the media and captivated attention. He promised a sort of Islamic populism that would have improved social welfare, but he failed to deliver and managed to unite the military, judiciary, and opposition parties against him, as well as the West. Whether or not there was a US backed coup is a point of great debate. On this program, I recently spoke to a Pakistani professor who argued that it was not a coup, an episode which I've linked to in the description. But judging by the crowds in the streets, many Pakistanis believe that there was in fact a coup and that the US played a role. To understand why so many Pakistanis are demonstrating in support of Imran Khan, I'm joined by Azhar Imran, a lecturer of political science at Punjab University. Azhar, welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleasures to be on your show, Rania. It's been always honor to learn from you and the work you've been doing with respect to the Middle East. Honor to be here.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm very happy to have you on to try to help us understand what's happening in Pakistan. I just very quickly want to offer a special thanks to Mahnaz and Sarah for helping arrange this. So let's start with, I think, the situation report. Imran Khan was removed. How would you describe the process by which Imran Khan was removed? It seemed to follow a normal constitutional procedure. So how can it be called a coup, right? Because there's this big debate about was it a coup, was it not? So can you explain what you believe happened from your point of view?
Well, Rania, to be very honest, interestingly, on the surface, it seems that Imran Khan was removed from the premiership under the very much constitutional wings. But those who are aware of the Pakistani politics knows very well that Pakistani politics on the front face, it is run through the constitution. But behind the door, there is also an invisible constitution that is more powerful. That invisible constitution has, dominated Pakistani politics, what we call the military establishment. And the military establishment, interestingly, to actually play a political role, have always, sought the support of the Supreme Court of Pakistan at the higher judiciary. So, in this context, what happens, on the front constitutionally was actually a military judicial coup against the Imran Khan. That was very much played, under the carpet of the constitution, under the formula of the constitution. But behind the scene, it was actually the military judicial establishment that wanted Imran Khan to be ousted. And he was, of course, ousted under a legal process. But the way the process was maneuvered has not only violated the constitution of Pakistan, the idea of the parliamentary supremacy, the separation of power between the state institution, mainly judiciary, executive, and of course the legislature. And there are reasonable number of lawyers who have argued the way Supreme Court actually pushed the vote of no confidence to be executed against Imran Khan had actually violated the many of the constitution's articles, as well as, of course, the very idea of the parliamentary sovereignty. And particularly with reference to parliamentary sovereignty, the office of the speaker, who is the custodian of the National Assembly, who has the power to elect as well as the ouster prime minister, was actually made a very postmaster office and a stamped office in this all process. So I think it was fairly, we can call it a judicial and military coup under the umbrella of the constitution that I will explain while we move forward. But that coup was, of course, abetted by Pakistani liberal media and the many liberal academic intellectuals and activists. So this is how I describe this whole scene.
Well, yeah, that's what we're hearing from a large segment of the Pakistani population. So I guess before we get into some of like the more, detailed stuff, is this is this it, do you think, for Imran Khan, or does he have a chance, do you think, at a comeback?
Very interestingly, if we look at the history of Pakistan, that tells us two very interesting things. What I think Imran Khan is doing to undo our history this time. So, if we look at the previous prime ministers, though since the 1947 when Pakistan came into being, none of the prime minister was able to fight back into the power once he was removed by the military. at least not for the next 5 to 10 years. So in the last 20 years of Pakistani politics, we have seen prime ministers coming and going out. The lately was the Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, who was disqualified by the Supreme Court under the corruption charges. And interestingly, Rania, those of Pakistani liberal media outlets who are now calling it a very constitutional process in the context of removal of Imran Khan were actually calling the removal of the prime minister under the same principle, under by and large the same constitutional structure, were calling it the violation of the constitution and a military and judicial coup, which now they are not subscribing to this idea. Now, coming to your question that can Imran Khan make a comeback? This is a very interesting question because there were a lot of media reports which were suggesting that the army had conveyed a very clear meaning to its core constituency, the lower rank officers and the soldiers who were very concerned about the removal of the Imran Khan because supposedly they were reluctant to accept this new political setup that have huge corruption charges. So the initially what we got to know from media, the reports were that it is the end of the Imran Khan's political innings. But interestingly, what happened on the Sunday night, right after a night he was removed from the office, it has actually turned down the tables. And now the military and its top brass are publicly saying that we are going towards the election, and whenever the election takes place, it will be free and fair election. And if the Imran Khan makes a comeback, we will accept it. Frankly speaking, the anti-Imran Khan media groups were very clear about that it is the end of the Imran Khan's politics, and he's going to face massive charges of corruption and many other things. So it's very hard for Imran Khan to come back. And right now, when Imran Khan is calling for a fresh election, the opposition and of course the military establishment don't want the election to take place in at least the next 6 to 7 months because it seems that Imran Khan is very popular right now, and if there is an election in a 2 month or 3 month under the constitution, he may not only come back to power, but he may even win a simple majority as well. Because we need to understand two things in mind. The ouster of Imran Khan was made so-called constitutional because Imran Khan had a majority seats in the parliament, but did not have a simple majority, which is required to form a government. So he had a coalition government, and other two or three parties, one from the Balochistan, which had 5 seats, Balochistan Awami Party, and the one from the Karachi, the urban center of the Sindh province, MQM, had 7 seats. They are very much popular to the Pakistani politics that they actually are controlled by the Pindi, which is actually a kind of a euphemism for the Pakistani military headquarters. So and it's very interestingly that before 72 hours before the vote of the no confidence takes place, the MQM and the Balochistan Awami Party actually stepped out of the coalition. So they kept waiting the signal from the Pindi, the military establishment, and once that signal was given, they called it for a broader democratic transition. We need to move forward. So this is how the so-called constitutional process. And here I also want to mention one of the facts that the Supreme Court acted so partisan in whole this scenario that they even made the office of the prime minister paralyzed. That I will explain once we move forward.
Okay. So, in that sense, how did Imran Khan alienate the people who opposed him? So, he kind of like ultimately, people in his own party, the military, basically the entire opposition united against him. How did that happen? Why did that happen?
Very interesting question. I think so. Many of the Pakistani media outlets are actually accusing Imran Khan for alienating and isolating the opposition. But I think it was not Imran Khan who alienated isolation. So we need to go back to into 2018 that how this powerful, we need to understand and to go back to 2018 to understand how the Imran Khan came into power. So basically, when in 2016 and 17, the Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was ousted through, of course, a judicial process. The pro Noon League, the pro Nawaz Sharif media wings, and the many of the liberals who were anti of the military establishment role, they started to call it that the military establishment is actually playing the shots, and this was a kind of a judicial coup through which the Nawaz Sharif was ousted. So in this context, they started to call that Imran Khan is actually being brought by the military, despite the fact he was a very much popular. So when Imran Khan came into power, so because the military was also being criticized by the opposition party, and so was the Imran Khan, who was seen as a kind of a military's political face. So it actually created an alliance between military and the Imran Khan. So in this context, when the military launched, when the political parties launched attack on many of the key military leaders, including the sitting army chief and the former DGISI, so it actually created a kind of consensus between Imran Khan and the military because the opposition was launching that attack. But then, of course, the military did not have an idea that Imran Khan will, once into the power and get his foot strong, he will try to actually implement his own civilian foreign policy agenda. And when the Imran Khan tried to do that, this was actually the message from the military that we can't control this guy, so we have to put him into the, a kind of equation. So eventually, the military started to have an, backdoor connection with the opposition parties, and the opposition parties, knew that we can't enter the power unless we have some kind of understanding with the military. So this is how equation works. So now that you're coming to your specific question, so actually the accusations leveled against Imran Khan by the opposition parties that he was dictatorial or he alienated and isolated was everything that was done by the military. And because
Mm.
Imran everything was done by the military because military and the opposition parties were actually colliding personally. And Imran Khan kept it a silent. That could be questionable, but his only political position was that in this context, why he should step into that. And once the fight between military establishment and the Imran Khan began, the same opposition parties, put all the burden and accusations on Imran Khan that was done by the military establishment. And they had an alliance, a kind of, undeclared alliance with the military establishment to go through this vote of no confidence. So in this context, of course, there is a political angle to that as well because Imran Khan built whole of his political narrative against corruption and the old, kind of school of thought that was prevailing in the Pakistani power politics. So in that context, he had to satisfy his constituency as well. But I would call it that Imran Khan did not alienate the opposition. Rather, it was the conflict between the military and the opposition that actually alienated the opposition. And once the military and the Imran Khan had a conflict, opposition stepped in for a kind of an alliance with the military and put all the burden on the Imran Khan that he has been the foreign policy failure, he has been the governance failure, he has been the economic failure, just to get back into the power. So this is how the equation has worked. That the question is very important that the same opposition parties in the media who were accusing the same military leadership of violating constitution, of extrajudicial killing, of enforcing enforced disappearances of these human rights activists and civil society activists, nor actually maintaining a complete silence once their parties have entered into a power relationship with the
Yeah.
military.
That's a really good point. It's a very important point. And I think, when we were talking about this before we were recording, you had said something really interesting, which, there's been this, like you mentioned, this narrative about, well, the military supported Imran Khan, they supported his rise to power, and then they opposed him and helped remove him. So, in that sense, like, why did the military support him? I've heard the theory that they needed an anti-American guy in that moment because they have a different perspective on Afghanistan than the US does. But why? Why did the military, I guess, either support him or not oppose him initially? Why were they riding the Imran Khan wave?
Well, Rania, to be very honest, I think there are two theories to undo those theories. Let me first go with this the liberal Pakistani narrative, with who they call this Imran Khan military alliance, the hybrid regime. The very interesting term that I will try to decode as well. So for them, the narrative was simple that Imran Khan was able to sell the narrative to the military establishment that all those old political parties are tested and tried. They are a sheer failure. They are corrupt. I have a team and let me come into power and I will reform the economy and I will reform the governance setup and that will give military more space to actually play out its foreign policy agenda. That's the liberal narrative. And according to them, it has been failed. I disagree with that. I do think that Imran Khan was fairly popular and perhaps the most popular politician in the Pakistan back in 2018 and right now. And if there was the political system like the US presidential political system, one person directly voting for the president, Imran Khan would have won single-handedly. But as we have a parliamentary democracy, so it needed a lot of local constituency political alliances to be into the power. So military brought it. What I think military brought it precisely for two reasons. One, the military had gone into conflicts with the old political parties, so military itself needed a kind of a civilian face a popular civilian face so the opposition's onslaught and criticism could be neutralized for the domestic masses. The second, and perhaps in my opinion, the most important point was that military, since the Obama's second tenure as a president, had a very poor relationship with the USA, particularly after the assassination of OBL in Islamabad. The military had a very different point of view with America over Afghanistan. One, the increasing influence of the India in Afghanistan with the backing of course, America. Second, the Ashraf Ghani-led Afghan government, the previous government was turning to be very hostile to the Pakistan military because they were accusing for the Taliban's rise. And of course, this kind of conflict of interest with America and with Afghan government, they needed a guy who is a popular, who actually opposes the American war on terror, and Imran Khan was opposing the American war on terror from last 2 decades. So they needed a civilian face who could actually provide a more democratic face to the anti-American policies and opposition by the military. So it was not Imran Khan who came through the military, hands. I would call it was the military who were in need of Imran Khan, who was actually supporting, who was actually opposing American war on terror from the last 2 decades, and they needed a public face, a popular political face, who could actually, who, and he, by the way, he was a Pashtun also, so who could actually had a support in the Pashtun areas, adjacent border areas of Pakistani province KPK and Afghanistan, but also in the mainland of Pakistan, which is mainly Punjab and the urban Sindh, Karachi, and Hyderabad. So Imran Khan was a guy equally popular in the mainland, but also opposing anti-American war on terror. So military actually wanted to settle the score with the USA through this democratic civilian face. So they brought Imran Khan into power. And actually, this is the reason they have now kicked Imran Khan out of the power, because they were thinking that we would somehow control Imran Khan. But
Right.
once Imran Khan back into the power, once Imran Khan was into the power, he actually tried to implement that agenda, and that was not only welcoming Taliban, which is very much problematic, but of course, from the American standpoint of view, it was a very smart strategic position, and also the way he dealt with India, then Iran, and then Saudi Arabia, and everything. So military started to actually rethink its own strategy. And when the American establishment also realized that we were okay with the military establishment, because if we had put some pressure, they will come to listen to us. But this civilian guy is not able to listen to us. So eventually, I think there was some background understanding between Pentagon and Pakistani, of course, military establishment, and then they did not think out how to get out of Imran Khan. So eventually, it took some time, and this is how the things got to manage to oust Imran Khan under a constitutional process, which was very much a judicial military coup.
Well, in that sense, when we talk about his rise and the military sort of riding it, like how important was the military in the rise of Imran Khan as opposed to the so-called lawyers movement? And could you maybe explain what that movement was?
Well, interestingly, to be very frank, Rania, I was then lawyer movement was the first political movement that I became part of it. Then I was studying at Punjab University in law college as a first year student, and we became very much part of it. So I can tell from my personal experience there were two theories, and those theories later on turned to be true. The first theory was it was a genuine democratic movement that we believed to be part of that. But later on, as we were, undergrad revolutionary, so when we grew up and we got to know that in terms of real politics, the things were taking place differently. So the theory was that Musharraf was becoming too unpopular, and military thought that what they wanted to do in Afghanistan, Musharraf's unpopularity was a barrier. And America was also on the same page that Musharraf has now become a lame duck. He cannot deliver American objective in Afghanistan. So we needed a popular face, a popular democratic face. So in this context, military and of course the American establishment were very much, withdrawing their support from the Musharraf. And according to many, theories now which have turned to be true, that Pakistan's intelligence agencies were backing the lawyer movement to get Musharraf under pressure so that he could be pushed for resign. And this turned to be true when American had an NRO, National Reconciliation Ordinance, a kind of an agreement between Musharraf and then late Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto to actually fight, politically together. And this is how the Musharraf, was overthrown from the power. And Benazir was attempted to bring back for actually a popular face to continue supporting war on terror with the military establishment and with the help of the Pentagon. But unfortunately, she died and she was assassinated in a terrorist suicide attack, which is still unclear who carried out that. But the reports were it was TTP Pakistan, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. So in that way, Liar movement was also backed and supported by the military intelligence of Pakistan because they thought Musharraf was not only becoming a liability for military, but also American did not want him to continue because he was so unpopular to deliver anything meaningful to Americans in Afghanistan. So in this context, military wanted a new civilian face, and so were the Americans. So eventually, there was an agreement with the help of America between Benazir Bhutto and the President Musharraf. So this is the equation. I think the similar kind of things had happened in the context of Imran Khan as well, because the Pentagon has realized that it is better to have disagreements but continue working with the Pakistani military establishment than to have a guy who's been going to be totally opponent to the American military policies in this region and who will not become part of any of the American future military contingencies in the context of China or Iran. And there is also an interesting fact, Rani, that we need to keep in mind. The only prime minister in last 20 years who have not met the director and the chief of the CIA who has visited Pakistan is Imran Khan. I think Michael Hayden,
Wow.
that's very interesting. So I'm sure you are aware of his interview in which he said absolutely not when a U.S. journalist asked to have a military bases in case America asks you to have a counter-terrorist attacks inside
Mhm.
Afghanistan, and he said absolutely no. And the reports came out that in after this interview, the CIA chief came to Pakistan to talk to Imran Khan and the military establishment about potential possibility of American CIA and of course the military having bases inside Pakistan to launch counter-terrorist attacks inside Afghanistan. And interestingly, Imran Khan refused to meet the CIA chief because he said he's an intelligence chief, so it is against the protocols. To the prime minister of the head of the government should be meeting a CIA chief. He should be meeting the intelligence chief and army chief of Pakistan and should convey his message to them rather than seeing the prime minister. And that is unbelievable in the context of Pakistan, where we have seen the average senators and the congressmen are walking into prime minister office like the viceroys, and they are actually talking to prime ministers and president for hours. And here comes the CIA chief, and the prime minister refused to meet him. So it also sent a very clear message to Washington Pentagon, but also it sent a message very clear to the Americans as well that this time if you talk to the army, you should not be believing that your things would be done unless there is a civilian go ahead with that. Because previously, the American had this practice that they will only meet the prime minister, but they will talk serious matters to the military and the intelligence chiefs. But this time, the prime minister gave a very clear meaning that even if you take them on board and I'm not on board, this is not going to happen. And this is
I
what the
see.
story has been.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that the removal of Imran Khan has provoked some of the largest protest in Pakistan's history, both in support of him, but also what seems to be in opposition to the traditional elites. So, is this just about Imran Khan, or is it also about a hatred of the ruling elites?
Rania, to be very honest, I think it would be too simplistic to call those protests only in love of Imran Khan. The way Pakistani liberals are actually, pitching that he's a
Mm,
celebrity, a philanthropist, an upper middle class is in love with his personality. I think this very simplistic, and I would call a political nonsense. I have been to these protests as well, and I have a lot of disagreements with Imran Khan,
mm,
particularly his position on and his statements on women as well and gender issues as well. I've been very critical of that, but we went to support Imran Khan, and I think there are multiple reasons. One, these protests are unprecedented to the Pakistan's history. If we look at the history of Pakistan, all those previous prime ministers, when they were removed either by military coups or by the judiciary and the Supreme Court, the people would have come on the roads to actually celebrate that removal.
mm.
Whether it was in the 90s, the Nawaz Sharif government or the BB government, and people will welcome the military, and the army chief would become a hero. But what we are witnessing this time, that unprecedentedly, the man Imran Khan was sitting in his home, and he just tweeted that you need to come out to save Pakistan, and there were massive protests, unparalleled and unprecedented. And what I call these protests, because I was part of those protests, they were actually, spontaneous and leaderless. So
Mm.
this is the one perspective. It's not simply Imran Khan. I think I would agree to you that there is a lot of hatred and failure of the all previous political elites. They have no policies to reform health system, no policies to overcome the problems of unemployment, the stagnant economic issues, and of course, at the same time, massive corruption. For example, I will talk to you later on. The sitting prime minister has heavy charges of corruption, the Shahbaz Sharif, and his son, who is going to be the chief minister of the largest province, has also heavy charges of corruption as well. So there is a lot of actually disenchantment with the previous political elite as well. So I would call it is, maybe it is in love of Imran Khan as well, but it is more important to see it in terms of hatred and failure of all the previous status quo political parties. And then I think there is also third phenomena, and that what I called the youth phenomena. So Pakistani
Mm.
youth, which is largest in terms of population, is around 60%. And
Wow.
many of the liberal writers have written it off that they are emotional with no understanding of history and irrational. But if you talk to them, they have one very genuine question: that what is their future, and how we are going to actually have a bright future and sustainable economy when we have such corrupt, people in power as well. And because of war on terror, we have lost a lot of economically and human casualties. And the only person who spoke against war on terror, and for very reason, the Imran Khan was also called by the liberals the Taliban Khan. So they actually see some hope in that, because if we are not having a bright future, jobs and employment, at least we should get rid of this war on terror thing that has damaged the society badly and have increased the extremism and religious fundamentalism in our society. So unless or until we get out of this war, we are unable to overcome that. So that's the second factor, I call it. The third factor was also that there is a huge anti-American constituency in Pakistan. Not because the Pakistani people are like they have in their genes to hate America, but but because of what America has done to this region.
Of
So
course.
we have Iran as our neighbor, and we are seeing huge sanctions on Iran, and Pakistan has a cultural and religious relationship with Iran. Then we have seen the war on terror, and then we have seen our Pashtun brothers and sisters becoming victim of war on terror, both in Pakistani Pashtun areas, the KPK, and also in the Afghanistan as well. And if you understand, I think you would be better able to understand and make sense of that. That Imran Khan's majority support is not coming from Punjab, is not coming from Karachi or Sindh. It is coming from Pashtun area, the
Mm.
KPK, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, where his government, his party is in power from last 10 years, and he had won in 2018 in the provincial assembly, the two-third majority, which has never happened in the history of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Not a single party which has ruled Khyber Pakhtunkhwa since creation of Pakistan was able to have two-third majority. And Imran Khan has a two-third majority because of his policy, apart from the governance. So I think there were multiple factors. So there was this feeling also that if Imran Khan is being removed by America, so we may be going again to the American war on terror, and we may be facing a new war. So there was multiple factors that led to his popularity. And of course, then there was a lot of urban constituency that Imran Khan enjoys as sport, as someone who has talked about national sovereignty, the independent foreign policy, no foreign dictation. And I think these are the ideas very close to people of Pakistan, because I have talked to a lot of my students, although I also come from a working class background and of course a public schooling. But when I talk to the Pakistani students studying in public sector universities, they at least say that if we don't have a hope or optimism about economy, about job, about education, at least we should have some respect for our national sovereignty and some kind of foreign independent foreign policy. So, and the liberal would call it as a populism, but there are genuine, actually, grounded roots of having claim for national sovereignty and independent foreign policy. So these are the multiple factors that I would call it the reason that gave Imran Khan such a huge support once he was ousted from the premiership.
And you touched on this briefly, but I'd like you to elaborate. Is it fair to say that Khan rejects Salafi fundamentalist Islam for a more Sufi Islam on the side of social justice, and that this has helped provoke the right-wing religious parties against him? Because I mean, some even made death threats against him. And then on top of that, why did some of the elite liberal left of the country call him, as you mentioned, Taliban Khan, if that's the case?
I think two very interesting things. If we look at the life of the Imran Khan and his political position on religion, I would rather call it a very much moderate Muslim. Of course, one can disagree with his understanding of religion as well. But also, we need to understand why do Imran Khan uses the religion into politics. Let's go back into mid 1990s, and I'm sure you know that he was then married to Jemima Khan, the British, uh, celebrity. So when Imran Khan started his politics, Jemima being marrying to Jemima, he was accused of being the Jewish lobby, and he was accused of a kind of hostility to the Islam and a threat to the Muslims and Islamic culture of Pakistan. So he was actually pushed to use that religious card for his safety as well as a form of that. Secondly, he genuinely believed that if we have any progressive future of our people and our state, it should come through a religious idea of welfare states, which he quite oftenly associates with state of Medina, the early state during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So this is what actually, and at the same time, he also criticizes the very, kind of the Western role in our region as well. So in this context, these all factors come together to actually make liberal anti of Imran Khan. On the one side, he talks about that we have only a future of a welfare state under the principles of Islam, a moderate Islam, where the poor are actually looked after by the state, where health is funded by the state, where education is funded by state. But he doesn't use the language of secularism or the modern Western political lexicology. He rather uses the more cultural context of religion, and I think that's understandable because this will make his message to be more resonant to the people. So that's what liberals calls it actually, the kind of a fundamentalist. Second, when he speaks in the language of religion and opposes the Western imperialism or Western wars in this region, it also create, a kind of, unsatisfaction among the liberals because their very idea of democracy has come from the West. And when they have to talk about a secular democracy, they have to look forward for the West as a model of democracy. And when Imran criticizes that their democracies are actually creating, extremism and terrorism in our societies and bringing the imperialist war into our region, it also delegitimizes their very discourse of democracy as a secular project. And of course, there are some what I call it the identity politics. So if we look at these liberal left, many of them have been teaching and writing in the West and USA and Britain, of course. Many of them have been direct beneficiary of the Western so-called developmental projects. I'm sure you know about USAID, United States Agency for International Development, which actually provides a huge number of scholarship to Pakistani students to pursue their masters and PhD programs, particularly after war on terror and 9/11. And if you look at the statistics, majority of the number of students who have won and gone to the scholarships to study in US and UK actually come from these very liberal left background. And then there comes an NGO, a kind of a class as well who actually do a lot of social work, but the funding is coming from the USAID and all that. So there is an identity politics as well. And then of course, many of the liberals think that in the new context of Pakistan foreign policy, it's better to be with Saudis and with the Washington, the old alliance, than to be part of the Tehran or the Beijing. So there is also this cultural disconnectivity, so called, with Chinese and Beijing, because in the private meetings they make joke and fun of the Beijing and the Chinese, and there's a lot of unfortunately racism to that as well. So there are a lot of factors that is keeping them restless with respect to rise of Imran Khan. So it would be very naive, and I would literally laugh out as the in last interview, my dear friend Taimur called it that Pakistan is like a fundamentalist and Islamist. That was literally a shock and surprise for me. But then coming from his background, Taimur teaches at LUMS, what I call the European University or the American University in Pakistan, like American University in Beirut. So, and he lives in a very compartmentalized life in one of the richest areas of Pakistan and doesn't understand the mainstream Pakistan. So that was understandable. It is the Pakistan. So, for example, I come from Jang, and he was talking about Jang in your interview. which have seen perhaps the most bloody sectarian violence from 1990s till the mid of 2020. The reason was because there was a huge Shia Sunni, clashes in my district. Many of my friends lost their parents and all that. And I've been to those madrasas, and there is in last 10 years there's a huge decline in this. And that was in a very short area or short region. And to call whole Pakistan an extremist society or a religious fundamentalist society, it would be literally, a kind of a joke. Pakistan is thousands times ahead of Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the way he was arguing, it seemed that Pakistan is actually worse than Iran and Saudi Arabia. So I won't subscribe to this. Yes, some of the Imran Khan's position on religions are really contestable or sometimes problematic, but it is not that. For example, I would give you the argument that if we look at the restoration of the religious worship places of non-Muslim minorities in Pakistan, the number of worships that have been restored under Imran Khan time has never been restored in the previous governments. We have seen, the churches to be rebuilt. We have seen the Hindus' religious places to be rebuilt, and we have seen a huge, renovation and rebuilding of the six pilgrimages and religious places, particularly the opening of the Kartarpur corridor as well. Because Imran Khan see the Pakistani civilization as an opening opportunity for interacting and, of course, inviting the religious tourism as well, which you will never see, which you will never come across to observe in the context of the Pakistani mainstreams English-speaking media and the newspapers as well.
Well, so, I wanted to also give you the opportunity to respond to, because I know that I think that you disagree with this claim, if I'm not mistaken. There's the idea that Khan is this right wing populist. He's been described as a right wing populist. So, how do you respond to that characterization? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Why?
Well, I think this is extremely a nonsense. But if anyone is making a claim, and I know a lot of people are making the claim, so let's get into the practice. So Imran Khan, when he's been called as right wing populist, he's been compared with either Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, or the Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. So Rania, you know better than me what Modi have been doing to the Muslims with respect to amendments in the law and bringing Muslims actually to the second-class citizens, and Jair Bolsonaro. For example, the Imran Khan has been called a right-wing populist. So if you look at Imran Khan, his whole of the policies are in the context of a progressive welfare state that no right-wing populist will talk about. So, for example, look at his domestic policies. He has always spoken in terms of welfare state that no right-wing populist will argue. Look at his foreign policy. He has always spoken that I will be a friend to the West in terms of peace, in cooperation, in economic development, but I will not be the friend of the West in waging war, in extending war, occupation of the sovereign people and their territories. So I think to call Imran Khan a right-wing populist is extremely biased, and I think because of the personal hatred that you don't like the guy and his politics. And also, if we look at that, it was the Imran Khan when he came into power. He extended the hand of peace with India, and he offered the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, that if actually you move one step for peace, Pakistan will move two steps for peace. So if a person who's a populist right wing, why he would be talking about having peace with India? Why he would be opposing the wars in Afghanistan? Why he would be talking about that we want to have a regional cooperation with Russia, with China, with Iran, but we will not becoming a state that actually been perceived as someone that provides military machines to the West for killing the people for the Western interest. So I think that was a very much clear that he does not carry a right-wing populist ideology the way we see in the context of Trump or Jair Bolsonaro, but also in the case of Narendra Modi. One point that I would love to make it here, that's very interesting because it also makes very much relevant for Pakistani liberals to call Imran Khan a right-wing populist, again, for identity politics. For example, for most of them, not for all, but for most of them, America is an ideal democracy. So when Trump becomes the president and moves into White House, how they are going to answer to the Pakistani audience that how a democracy has been hijacked by a right-wing white supremacist. And
Right.
similarly, the same constituency of Pakistani liberals argue for peace with India. and how they're going to respond to the Pakistani masses when we see the New Delhi has a right-wing Hindu racist prime minister. So eventually, they will actually come to defend their defense of American democracy and the Indian democracy by equating, look, because we are also having a right-wing populist, so that's why the India and the US are having a right-wing populist. Although there's a hell of difference between Trump, between between Modi and Imran Khan. Imran Khan has built his politics, one, as a support star, and second, because of his massive philanthropic work, which includes one cancer hospital and also a university. So I think that's a very much unfair equation. And even to you talk to Pakistani masses, they will not be able to understand what does the term right-wing populist mean, in the context, because they
Yeah.
see it, they actually see it in the more context of the Pakistani politics. One last point about that, why I don't think he's a right wing populist, because I think Imran Khan's use of religion and this popular narrative also to be seen in the context of Pakistani politics. For example, Rania, in Pakistani politics, the national ideological narrative has always been dominated by the military. While first time we are seeing that Imran Khan, while using the religion as a national discourse or national narrative, and linking it with a kind of welfare state, has pushed the military on the back benches. Otherwise, it was military who used to be claimed to be national narrative in the language of religion. First time we are seeing a civilian having a claim on national narrative, and actually disassociating the dominance of military. So this is also a unique perspective that we need to look into the Pakistani politics.
Well said. Well, I also, this is something you also referenced, but I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit. What was Imran Khan's role in opposing drone strikes and military operations in Pakistan's tribal region to oppose drone strikes and like those military operations? Like, what was his role? And do you think that made that played a role at all in his ouster, his position on
I,
those things?
I think I would agree with you. But before on to explain this, I think it's very important to make one more point very clear. Most of the Pakistani leftists who are now standing with the current regime, the Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif, and the on the back of that is the military establishment, and they were actually supporting Imran Khan's position of not allowing drone strikes as well as military operation in the Pakistani tribal areas. They then supported Imran Khan, but then now they actually oppose Imran Khan because they think that Imran Khan is a right wing populist. Now, the question is, if Imran Khan, was opposing American military operations and drone strike inside the tribal areas of Pakistan, and you call it a pure progressive, anti imperialist policy, why you are actually calling for the same thing Imran Khan is saying now, that we should not become part of the American war on terror, and by providing military bases to American war on terror, to continue operate from our soil and use our airspace, will actually give a very bad message to the Afghanistan and the Afghan people. Now the same left and the same liberals are actually called on the same ground as a right-wing populist. Now, coming back to your question, that's very interesting. I think no politician has opposed as much Pakistani military establishment, the President Jinnah Musharraf, and the American military establishment with respect to war on terror as has done the Imran Khan. And I think that was the very precise reason that military was uncomfortable with him, because military had its own disagreement with Imran Khan. Sorry, military had its own disagreement with USA with respect to the war on terror and its modalities. But military actually never stood by the Imran Khan narrative that he totally opposed the military operation and drone strikes, because there are a lot of reports now that military was also providing the intelligence to the CIA for the drone strikes. So I think it is the drone strike incident, the drone strike episode has only been kept alive by one person in Pakistani politics, and that has been the Imran Khan. And no other politician has spoken so vigorously, because now we have seen a lot of media reports in which there are books as well, and the media reports in the US media where the former president Zardari, now the PPP chairman, and many other prime ministers have gave a T-set support to the American to continue the drone strikes as well. I think one of the reasons that Imran Khan has been ousted, I would not precisely link it with his opposition to the drone strike. I think that's a minor episode, but I would rather call it his overall opposition to the American involvement in Afghanistan or in Pakistani tribal areas once the American had withdrawn. So this was unacceptable to Americans and as well as to the military establishment, because after all, Pakistan military establishment, with all disagreement, has its major support and its major interest with respect to military and economy with the American establishment. So military establishment also thought that we do have disagreements with the Pentagon, but we don't want such a powerful guy in the prime minister office who could actually go to that length to change the what I call the paradigm shift in Pakistan foreign policy that Imran Khan was trying to do.
And then, prior to, I guess, moving to more now like the today, prior to the war in Ukraine, um, Imran Khan's non-aligned position on that issue obviously raised a lot of eyebrows. What was his relationship like, though, with the US government prior to the war in Ukraine, and his position on that?
I think that of course I would go back to 2016 because when the President Obama was almost to exit from the White House and the Trump had to step in, I think the Pakistan army had problem with America on policy disagreements with respect to Afghanistan. And Imran Khan was the one who was always calling out that Americans should withdraw, we will support you, we will help the negotiating process. So I think I would call it that there were no kind of active relationship, but there were no passive relationship as well during the time of the American President Trump, because Trump wanted to withdraw due to his own foreign policy agenda, and it actually suited Pakistan that we should support American withdrawal and should bring Taliban on the negotiating table, and that's why. In the second half of the President Trump, Imran Khan was invited by President Trump to visit the White House with respect to what's going on in Afghanistan. But as you know, that American military establishment and the Pentagon did not want to withdraw, and they opposed. We know that they opposed Trump policy of withdrawal as well. And in this context, the American military establishment thought that with the help of Pakistani intelligence and military establishment, we can actually defeat the Taliban. And this was the bone of the contention that actually was present between Pakistan, Imran Khan, military establishment, and the American military establishment as well. But Trump was the major, barrier to that. But once the Trump lost the election and Biden was back to the power, and Biden was the vice president under President Obama, so he knew it very well that what are our problem with the Pakistani military establishment. And because when President Biden was vice president, he visited Pakistan, and Imran Khan actually called for a protest when he was in Pakistan in Islamabad. So American establishment did not consider Imran Khan as a viable option. So I would say that during the Trump administration, because somehow Trump wanted to withdraw, so there was a kind of line of communication. But once the Biden was back into White House, and Biden knew it that Imran Khan was opposing America's war on terror, so he did not consider Imran Khan to talk about the Afghanistan issue. And I think this was the major reason that brought Pentagon and Pakistani military establishment background to work on some kind of workable relationship. And I think what I call the coup, that American gave a message to the military establishment very clearly that we are willing to work with you. We are willing to overcome the issues that the both military establishment have. The President Biden is okay with that, but we cannot work with the Prime Minister Imran Khan because he called Osama bin Laden the martyr, he called Taliban the freedom fighter, he called American foreign policy the failure in the region, he called Iranian the very self-esteemed nation. So when he was talking so much about anti-America, even becoming prime minister, so I don't think so. The hubris of the American imperialism will give that man a space to negotiate. So that was how the ouster was actually executed.
And, also speaking of his foreign policy, Khan had recently signaled a desire to improve ties with India, which you mentioned.
Yes,
He had
yes.
also refused to condemn China after Western allegations of human rights abuses against Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Was this controversial in Pakistan and overall? I know it was controversial in the US, of course. And also, did Khan take a position on Kashmir or Palestine that was different from his predecessor or successor?
Thank you very much for asking this question, because I think this should be the center of our program that we are having. Yes, I totally agree with you. Let's start with the China question. And look, I think Khan's position on China was very realistic and diplomatic. I'm not saying that he did not have concern the reports coming out about Uyghur Muslim and the role of the Chinese state. I personally think that off the record, many of his ministers conveyed that he had conveyed his concern. But given the strategic relationship that Pakistan have with China, it was not, friendly to call out diplomatically and publicly. So I think so. And also in Pakistan, majority of the people are unconcerned about the China Pakistan thing and the human rights thing as well. Yes, interestingly, the liberals who called Imran Khan's position problematic are rather called Chinese stooge. Actually, the one who actually made it a human rights issue, while these liberals, kept silent when he was opposing American atrocities in Afghanistan and war on terror.
Mm.
One point. The second point, look, the Pakistan's policy on Kashmir has been in two ways. I will explain. One, that we cannot have a peace with India unless the Kashmir is resolved. Second, that we will not accept any other solution except the Kashmir to become part of Pakistan. And that has been the policy that has been dictated by the military.
Yeah.
Interestingly, when the Prime Minister Narendra Modi amended the status of the Kashmir and divided the Kashmir territory, and some of its Hindu majority areas of Kashmir were brought under the control of the New Delhi, the federal government. And Imran Khan went to the Pakistani part of the Kashmir and addressed their legislative assembly. And here he made a very historic speech, and he said that we will respect the Kashmiri decision on Kashmir, even if they want an independent and separate state. So once the Kashmir has got freedom from India, we will accept the Kashmiri decision if they want to separate from Pakistan and they want to have a separate independent state. And that actually sent a very shock wave to the military establishment as well. That has never been the military establishment position, and nor have it been the Pakistan's official diplomatic position in UNO and in the Western forums. So it was the Prime Minister Imran Khan who even extended the right of self-determination to Kashmiris to the extent to become independent if they get freedom from India. So that was historical. Now coming to the second part, there are reports in media that, and I think those reports are true, that why military establishment finally decided to send Imran Khan to home. The reason was that military establishment wanted to start back channel negotiation with India. And there were reports that the Pakistani DGISI had been meeting Indian National Security Advisor. And when there was a breakthrough happening, Imran Khan was the one who actually, pulled it out to breakthrough to not happen. Why? Because Imran Khan put a very term and condition that until or unless Prime Minister Narendra Modi withdraws all those constitutional and legal actions which have abrogated the autonomous status of Kashmir and had broken the status quo in Kashmir, Pakistan will not initiate any kind of economic or diplomatic activity. While the military wanted that we should go for negotiation, what has happened in Kashmir has happened, so let's forget. It was the Imran Khan who thought that it would be a political suicide and he would become a villain in the eyes of Kashmiris. And if you talk to Kashmiri diaspora today in West, in America and Europe, and in Kashmir, literally, no one is talking about in Pakistani media the protests that have happened in Indian Kashmir with the ouster of Imran Khan and also the Kashmir of Pakistan, because they thought that they have got first time a prime minister who does not speak the language of military establishment on Kashmir. So that was his position on Kashmir, where he actually had gone, out of the Pakistan traditional policy, where we consider Kashmir as integral part of Pakistan, but he talked about the right to self-determination. Now coming to Palestine, so
Mm.
I'm sure. So coming to Palestine, that's very interesting. As the Pakistan's current army chief had served in the UNO peacekeeping missions, so and there were reports that the military establishment, and if you look at the Pakistani military top brass, the next 4 or 5 generals who are in line to become the next army chief, because the current army chief is going to retire in November, and there are reports that it was also one of the reasons that Imran Khan was ousted, because the military establishment did not want Imran to appoint a new army chief who would support his foreign policy agenda. So
Mm.
if we look, so if we look at the current 4 or 5 top generals in line who are going to be next. Among them are going to be the next army chief. All of them have a Western academic background, and they have studied in American military academies. So this was also one of the factors. So there are reasonable reports that those journalists who are considered close to Pakistani military establishment were asked to actually start debates and programs that why Pakistan is not accepting the Israel. And there were a lot of programs that in my adult life I have not seen taking place in Pakistani Urdu media on TV
Mhm.
channels, and creating a public opinion, normalizing relationship with the Israel. And when it was and,
Uh-oh.
and you could see that. And when it was asked about military spokesperson, so we have a military spokesperson called, an institution that actually talks military's position on issues. It is run by what we call ISPR, Inter Services Public Relationship. So the military spokesperson came onto the media, and when he was asked, "What do you think of these debates starting place and taking place in Pakistani media about Israel?" He said, "Pakistan, supports the Palestinian, but we are okay if there are more freedom of speech to discuss our foreign policy." So you see,
Uh-oh.
they will never previously allow that, but this
Yeah.
time the military had a more soft position and tried to paint themselves as a champion of freedom of speech. So we should discussing in Urdu media and Urdu TV channels about Israel. And then the Prime Minister Imran Khan was criticized that somehow he's also supporting this narrative. And then he came on the front, he addressed the public rallies, and he said that Israel is an enemy of Palestine, and until unless Israel grants the right to self-determination and statehood to the Palestinian people, no one can dare to accept and recognize Israel as part of Pakistani diplomatic relationship. And he categorically stated that not in my prime ministership, but even if I'm out of the office, and any government tries to do that, I will not let it happen with the people power. And I think the message was very clear, because the military establishment was thinking that with the having diplomatic relationship with Israel, we will have more weapons, we will have more influence and clout in Washington D.C. and Pentagon, and we may be able to neutralize the India as well. And
Mm.
frankly speaking, all those people who were calling Imran Khan right-wing populist propagandist, they actually used his anti-Israel narrative to advocate their stance that that's why he's a populist, right wings. He's not opposing Israel for principal position for a Palestinian, but he's doing for his own politics. And the liberals welcome that. And many of Pakistani retired bureaucrats welcome that. Many generals welcome, and the Pakistani media, the English media particularly, welcome that we should actually have an open debate. It was Imran Khan who called it off that we will not. So if you talk to Kashmiris and if you talk to Palestinians, and one of the reasons that in the first time in the history of Pakistan that any prime minister has been removed, and there are protests in London, in Washington, in Australia, in New Zealand, all over the Western capitals. And if you look at that, majority of the people who protested outside Pakistan were actually Kashmiris, and there were a lot of Arabs and the Palestinians as well.
So I wanted to ask you on a bit of a different topic here, and that is how important in Pakistan is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and was Imran Khan opposed to further dependence on it? And if so, is there even an alternative to the IMF?
Frankly speaking, I think, unfortunately, I'm a bit critical of Imran Khan's relationship with IMF as well. I think he continued with the IMF policies, but one must acknowledge that he did not have an option when he came into power. The economy was in a very, you know, poor condition, and we did not have an option. And although Imran Khan had previously, before becoming the prime minister, has opposed IMF policies, and he made many popular statements as well. But when he came into power, he was initially reluctant to go with IMF agenda and plan. This is what his economic policy was, but economy was in a very poor condition. He did not have an option, and he had to go for IMF. Unfortunately, the IMF plan had a very poor impact on our economy, and then we had also to go through the COVID as well. So certainly, the IMF plan program had a inflation, poverty, unemployment. But Imran Khan did have a plan, and he was trying that once the COVID is over and we are able to bring back our economy with 5 or 6% of annual growth, we will definitely go to get out of IMF. But yes, I would agree with those who are critics of Imran Khan with respect to IMF, because Imran Khan had continued previously policies of IMF. But then I would agree there is no option that Pakistan should go for unless Pakistan increases tax collection, and unless Pakistan actually increases its exports as well. There is no alternative to that. There were alternative to IMF and World Bank, and it was either the Saudi Arabia or the China. But then, of course, Imran Khan offended Saudi Arabia as well, because of his principal support for Iran and his principal support for Palestine and his opposition to Israel as well. And I'm sure you have the knowledge that Imran Khan was also creating an anti-Islamophobic alliance with the help of Iran, Turkey, and Malaysia, and they all actually and Saudis considered against their foreign policy interest. So Pakistan was also forced to go for IMF, because there was no option for Pakistan than the IMF. Because if we had to have borrowed loans from Saudi Arabia, we had to compromise our foreign policy, and if we had to borrow loans from China, I don't think so the amount of the loan was enough to compensate our economic problem. So that's why he had to go for IMF. But he, in his repeated speeches, has said that this is a temporary solution. This is not the final solution, and sooner or later we had to overcome. And one reason that he went to Russia was that if we had some kind of energy and
Mm.
other imports from Russia, it will actually give us more stability with respect to dollars, and we would
Right.
have less dependency on IMF, World Bank as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly suspicious that the entire corrupt political class, the mainstream media, the corrupt judiciary, the military high command, like all at the same time want this guy out, especially after his Russia visit. And it all happened at once. But, I wanted to ask you, you teach at Pakistan's largest public sector university in Lahore, which is Punjab University. And in Pakistan, the divide between the elites and most of the population resembles kind of like the feudal era, which I think is true of a lot of countries in the developing world. And many of your students hail from Pakistan's lower socioeconomic strata, if I'm not mistaken. So, that said, how do the poor and working classes, I know you can't speak for all of them, but generally speaking, how do the poor and working classes view Imran Khan?
Well, I think if I have to answer your question in terms of politics, I think he enjoys the mass support, mass popularity. That's what my personal experience is, because I also come from a rural background, and I teach at a public sector university, and I mostly engage with the a lower middle class and working class students. So he enjoys a mass popularity and support, and that's why we have seen massive protests as well. In terms of politics, because Pakistan has a parliamentary democracy, and when these people have to vote, I think that would be still a very challenging thing for Imran Khan to convert their vote into a political power. Because in Pakistan, we have a parliamentary democracy, an indirect way of election of prime minister, and a lot of local realities come into play for the voting consideration. But no doubt, as long as his support is concerned, I would call it a myth, and I would call it a deliberate intellectual bankruptcy and dishonesty to call Imran Khan's movement a middle class or upper middle class movement. He enjoys a huge support among the working class, particularly the working class students, and those working class students are not only the Punjabis but also the Pashtuns, and also in the urban areas of the Sindh, mainly in Karachi as well. So I would say that he enjoys a mass support. When last time I went to the protest after his ouster, it was not only the middle class and upper middle class coming to the protest. I have seen a lot of working class students who were actually traveling on public transport to be part of the protest as well. So I think that's a myth or a deliberate intellectual dishonesty to call his support and movement only among the middle class or upper middle class.
And then, I know that we had talked about this before. There are tensions between the army and problems with the popularity of the army chief, right? The army
Yeah.
chief does, of course, have an outsized role for what we would call a democracy. So, can you talk a little bit about those tensions and the decreased popularity for the army chief and what that means with respect to Imran Khan?
This is a really difficult question to answer with honesty. while sitting in Pakistan,
Ah, of
because
course.
you have to look after your security as well. But let
I
me try to
understand.
try to explain into two or three contexts. Well, the criticism that has been taking place against army chief is not first time. The same army chief was criticized by the Pakistani liberals and the English press back in 2018, what they called supposedly the hybrid regime of Imran Khan, and they called the current army chief as an instrumental for bringing this hybrid regime into power. And now the same liberal press and the same media is actually calling the army chief the neutral, the pro-democrat, the champion of the democracy, and of course, and he has stood firm to the constitution because the so-called Imran Khan tried to abrogate the constitution. Now, coming to that, I think yes, I would agree to you that the army chief is going through perhaps a very huge popularity crisis, because one reason which we can talk about, I have spoken to a lot of soldiers and officers, and there are media reports as well, that among the young officers and the soldiers, the first time we are seeing a civilian prime minister who's more popular than an army chief. And there is an interesting equation that all those middle class and upper middle class urban areas where Imran Khan enjoys support, all those supporters are having military background. So that's very interesting. And many of the analysts argued that after such a massive support and slogan against army chief, why the army did not pick the people, because most of them were coming from military background. And there is also reason that I call it that right now the army chief is under heavy clouds, because if Imran Khan was able to build his narrative that there is an American conspiracy to that very strongly, and then there came the question by the retired officers and soldiers that if it was an American conspiracy, why did army remain neutral? That was army's official position,
Mm.
although they did not remain neutral. But liberal media advocated and English press that army is neutral, neutral meaning opposing Imran Khan but not coming on the front. So the question came from the retired officers and soldiers. And this is a huge constituency for Pakistani army chief. So there are almost 2.5 million retired soldiers and officers, and they have an association known as Ex-Servicemen Association. And their secretary and president came publicly, had a press conference, and supported Imran Khan and criticized the General Bajwa, the army chief. So the army chief had to run to Karachi, to the Lahore, to the Pindi, where we have the largest retired soldiers, and had to address them for 5 6 hours and had to clear his position. And this is very interestingly, and if you're following Imran Khan's public rallies, he is not really speaking against army. He's simply giving some implicit signals that how Pakistan foreign policy has been compromised by the people in the military establishment. But he praises the soldiers, their sacrifices, and that has been, very interesting political position that Imran Khan is taking vis-a-vis army, because he is continue to have massive support within the lower ranks of the army officers and the soldiers, because
Mm.
who considered this war on terror really a war that we were unnecessarily pushed into that. But of course, the military elite, the top brass, has its own economic and strategic interests with Washington, and that's has been the history. So this is very interesting that now, at least first time, we are seeing that a prime minister has been ousted and the accusation has been leveled against the army chief. And the first time a civilian prime minister supposedly seems to be more popular among the army low rank officers and soldiers than a sitting army chief. That's what I can say. I cannot further go into details because of that
Understood,
motive.
understood. I don't yeah, of course, I don't wanna jeopardize you in any way. I wanted to ask you, though, you had mentioned to me that there's this expression in Pakistan that it's run by the 3 A's, right? Allah,
Yeah.
Army, and America. Can you explain what that means and how it kind of gives us an idea of the role that America plays in Pakistani affairs?
Very interestingly, and I'm thankful for you to ask this question. Well, there is a popular phrase that American, and British historians who are writing on Pakistani politics have used that, and this is also a very popular phrase of the Pakistani politics as well. That Pakistan is run by 3 A's: Allah, Army, and America. That means there are 3 powers in Pakistani politics: the Allah, the Army, and the America. So, what does Allah here mean? Allah here means that the way the religion in Pakistani state has been used, it has been used by army, and it has been interpreted the way American wanted the Islam and the religion to be interpreted for their strategic interest. particularly in the Cold War era against Soviet Union, where the communists were called infidels, anti-religious, and anti-Islam. So interesting thing is that the way Pakistani state has used religion in our statecraft, in our geopolitics, it has been used by the military. So military has a sole dominance over religious narrative and discourse. But the way the religion was interpreted or defined was in aligned with the American strategic interest in this region. So what we are seeing, interestingly, first time in Pakistan, that Imran Khan has interpreted religion in a way that has actually made it anti-imperialist, anti-America, and it has also isolated the military's dominance over the religious narrative and discourse as well. And it is also the one of the reasons that many of the Pakistani liberals and leftists are calling Imran Khan a right-wing populist and fundamentalist, because the first time he has been using a religious narrative and has linked it with anti-Americanism, anti-imperialism, but also his understanding of religion is not what military's understanding of religion was with respect to national ideology. So with his religious interpretation, one, his religion stands against the American interest in this region, but by that default, also he has challenged the military's dominance over interpretation of religion with national ideology. So this time it's very interestingly happening. So Allah Army in America was used in the context that only that version of religion will be used in Pakistani politics, which suits army and which suits American interest in this region. But Imran Khan has actually reversed this equation very interestingly, that he has used the religion to build an anti-imperialist narrative, but he has also used the religion to link it with the welfare state and not the way the army used to link the religion with the national ideology. And that's what the liberal are, feeling sleepless and not admitting that this is the first time we have seen within the same discourse of religion, the army's dominance over religion has been, isolated, as well as the American dominance over religion in the Pakistani context has been also, defeated.
Well, on that note, Azhar, I really want to thank you for coming and breaking all this down. This was a really informative conversation, and I really appreciate your perspective. And we're going to be watching the developments in Pakistan, and hopefully, we can have you back on to offer more insight. I really appreciate it. And also, I just want to note, I I do love the fact that we can. I mean, we did have someone on who kind of gave a different perspective than you did. You mentioned Timur last week, so I love the fact that we have you on and you're able to provide context and also really like we can provide a platform for what seems to be a very common view among Pakistanis, as we can see by these massive crowds, about what took place and the fact that they believe there was in fact a coup against Imran Khan. So thank you so much. I mean, I guess the last thing I would ask you is, where can people follow you?
Thank you very much, Ramya, and it's honor and pleasure to be with you. And of course, it was an special honor because you've been one of my favorite, journalists and activists, particularly, your podcast on videos on, what's happening in the Arab world and the Muslim world in the
Well, thank
context of
you.
Lebanon. Lebanon have always been a source of inspiration and an intellectual insight that I have used with my students as well. As long as the follow is concerned, I use my Facebook most of the time. I post and write on that, so it's with my name Azhar Imran. So you can follow me on Facebook as well, and I'm also on the Twitter as well, and it is with Dawal Advocate Azhar. So you can also follow me on that as well, or I can put the link of my Facebook and Twitter on your page as well, and people can follow me.
Sure. Thank you so much. I will actually include those in the description. I really appreciate you joining me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.